The United Nations 30th Conference of Parties, COP30, begins in Belém, Brazil on November 10th. It marks a decade since the Paris Climate Pact came into force. Now, a lot has changed since the landmark treaty was adopted, and at the same time, the needle hasn't moved much on several long-standing climate issues. Also, Indigenous leaders from Andes arrived in Belém to attend the COP30 Climate Summit. Their main goal was demanding a greater say in how their territories are managed as climate change escalates and industries including mining, oil drilling and logging press deeper into forest. In the run-up to COP30, more than 60 countries have submitted revised climate action plans. However, by all accounts, collective ambition will not be enough to keep global warming below the threshold set at Paris. Well, Environment Minister Bhupendra Yadav will represent India at 30th UN Climate Change Conference. India will highlight its clean energy progress, having reached its 50% non-fossil power target ahead of schedule while pushing for practical adaptation indicators. Earlier, reaffirming its commitment to multilateralism and towards preserving and safeguarding the architecture of the Paris Agreement, India called on all nations to ensure that the next decade of climate action is defined not only by targets but by implementation, resilience and shared responsibility based on mutual trust and fairness. During the 12-day-long conference, talks will focus on implementing the Paris Agreement, climate finance and adaptation plans as countries move from promises to action now. This is the first COP where the full Paris policy cycle is in effect. And the United Nations says millions of refugees are stuck in a vicious cycle of conflict and climate extremes. The UN is urging the COP30 Climate Summit to provide financing for the most vulnerable communities. That the UN High Commissioner for Refugees says that within 15 years, places currently hosting nearly half of the world's refugees could face extreme climate shocks. Now, by mid-2025, 117 million people had been displaced by war, violence and persecution, and 3 in 4 are living in countries with high to extreme climate risk. The agency says extreme weather is destroying homes and forcing families who already fled violence to flee again. UNHCR warns that refugee camps in Africa could face nearly 200 days of hazardous heat per year. The report also highlights funding cuts, including by the United States, and says this is limiting protection. Now, UNHCR is calling on COP30 to deliver real action and real climate finance. COP30 venue is facing dire shortage of hotel rooms. Many pavilions were still under construction as of Sunday. With capacity for 6,000 people, 2 cruise ship tour came from Europe at the last minute to provide extra room for foreign delegates massing on Belém, a city of 1.4 million residents, of whom more than half live in shanty towns. Some guests have complained about small quarters and the long distance from the port of Otero to the conference venue, some 20 kilometers that take about 45 minutes by bus. In the months leading up to the conference, with Belém's few hotels full, organizers scrambled to rustle up delegate accommodation in private homes, universities and schools than the 2 ships. But green groups have pointed to the irony in fuel guzzling, carbon spewing, water polluting cruise ships hosting delegates to a planet-saving conference. Well, every year, COP Summit generates hundreds of headlines on global climate action. This year's began on Monday in the Brazilian rainforest city of Belém. But what exactly happens at the annual UN Climate Conference? Here's what you need to know.
The annual conference on climate is known as a COP, which stands for Conference of the Parties that signed the 1992 UN Climate Treaty. The treaty, called the UN Framework on Climate Change Convention or UNFCCC, committed countries to working together to fight climate change, a problem they acknowledged all countries faced and was best tackled together. The treaty also established the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, meaning the rich countries responsible for most of the planet warming emissions bear a greater responsibility in solving the problem. One of the priorities at COP30 will be to create a roadmap to track global adaptation progress. The roadmap will also need to be sensitive to the fact that social inequalities make some people more vulnerable than others. COP30 is focused on implementation, inclusion, and innovation. During the summit's first week, country negotiators will lay out their priorities and gauge one another's positions. Negotiators are joined by national ministers during the second week to haggle over final decisions, including legal and technical details. For many, this year's 30th Climate Summit marks as a full circle moment. Brazil had hosted the Rio Earth Summit, where the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Treaty, was signed 33 years ago. Central to Brazil's climate finance agenda is the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, a performance-based fund aiming to mobilize $4 billion annually to reward countries for conserving tropical forests. This year, the country insisted the event would return to its roots in acknowledging the world's most vulnerable, including indigenous groups, with some joining the talks. Brazil has asked the countries to work on realizing past promises, such as COP28 pledges to phase out fossil fuel use rather than making new ones. COP30 is also the first to acknowledge failure in meeting the past goal of preventing warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. Most national governments send teams to the talks. Often, countries speak together in groups with similar interests. Some of the most prominent voices include the Alliance of Small Island States, facing an existential threat from rising seas, and the G77 plus bloc of developing countries, including Africa Group and the BASIC Group consisting of Brazil, South Africa, India, and China. On the first day of his second term, US President Trump signed another executive order to withdraw the US from the agreement for a second time, but officially US is set to exit the Paris Treaty in January 2026. Aarti Rana's report for DD India.